Okay, hello and welcome everyone. We have a really exciting talk scheduled for today. Before we start, just a reminder that during the talk, you can type in your question in the Q&A box and our speaker will answer them either during or after the talk. And now Dr. Molayeva will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Risa Nakase Richardson, who will present today on the topic of sleep and traumatic brain injury research translational journey. Dr. Risa Nakase Richardson is a clinical research neuropsychologist at the James Haley Veteran Hospital and a professor and research director at the Morsani College of Medicine, Pulmonary and Sleep Medicine Division at the University of South Florida. Dr. Nakase Richardson has worked in neurorehabilitation in both clinical and research capacities since 1998. She is a fellow of the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine and National Academy of Neuropsychology. Dr. Nakase Richardson has over 100 publications and over 200 presentations at scientific meetings. She has served a principal investigator and co-investigator on 19 grants funded by various federal agencies and private organizations, including Veteran Affairs, United States Department of Defense, Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, National Institute of Health, National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, among others. On a personal note, I first met Dr. Nakase Richardson in 2013 in Galveston, Texas, where we were invited by the Transitional Learning Center and the University of Texas Medical Branch to be part of the international team working on the development of guidelines for primary care physicians to survey sleep disorders in persons with moderate to severe chronic traumatic brain injury. Dr. Nakase Richardson led our group. Since then, we have met at various meetings and conferences, and it was always a great pleasure to learn of her advancing research on sleep in traumatic brain injury. Please welcome Dr. Nakase Richardson today, who kindly agreed to share her research translation journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Molayeva. I appreciate the invitation and opportunity to speak with your prestigious institution. Many of the folks who have worked there historically have inspired some of the work that I'll talk about today. And I'll even mention the think tank meeting that we both participated in 2013 later in my talk. So it's my pleasure to hail from Tampa, Florida, where I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I always like to show this beautiful building where we provide rehabilitation for service members and veterans who've suffered a TBI, and where I get to implement much of the research that I will talk about today. So in fairness, I have to identify my disclosures. I have received funding from these various institutes, and the data I'll be sharing with you comes from those projects. The views today are my own and not that of the federal government or PCORI. And today what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms by which sleep problems can hinder neurologic recovery and potentially promote accelerated aging after TBI. So elucidate those mechanisms. I then want to talk about a framework for thinking about the evaluation and management of sleep problems post-TBI, and discuss common barriers to implementing evidence-based care for treating one specific sleep disorder. And I'll give my rationale for why I started with that one later, earlier in neurologic recovery following TBI. So the talk is titled A Research Translation Journey because in working for the Department of Veterans Affairs, it's not unlike the healthcare system that you have in Canada, where the funder, i.e. the Department of Veterans Affairs, is really on the hook for lifetime care following an injury or for veterans' health. And because of that, there is a strong presence for health services and implementation research. And that's my first exposure to those bodies of science was joining the Department of Veterans Affairs in 2008. And so one of the things that I've done to kind of help connect in my mind how different scientists work together to promote access to evidence-based care is to adapt this figure from adaptations of this exist in other presentations from VA. But what I want you to appreciate here is this 20,000-foot perspective of science today, specifically that around medical care. And starting here on the left side of this screen, you'll see bodies of research that sound familiar to us. I think many of us on the call today would classify ourselves as clinical researchers. We study patients in their clinical setting, but there are other bodies of science that inform our care and that our care informs, and that is more traditional bench research and health services research. One of the things that I want to impress upon you is that the scientists that fall into those three domains typically are very distinct. They have different training, and often they never interact with one another. And so the science that evolves and develops doesn't move along the continuum, if you will. But theoretically, findings from bench research inform clinical research, and it informs how we deliver healthcare. Now, as we move towards the middle of this image, imagine that once we've identified some effective treatments and we've shown treatment efficacy, the evolution or the path towards promoting its use in everyday care can transition to effectiveness research, and that is studying how well a treatment or an intervention works in real world settings. That's the concept behind pragmatic trials, and the knowledge generated from those studies inform knowledge translation documents like clinical practice guidelines or consensus statements. Now, a couple of things. So from there, we want to see things move into practice. But what I have are some bullet points on the bottom that are important takeaways. Now we know there was a nice systematic review done showing that 14% of research can take an average of 17 years to reach the patient's bedside. And what they specifically studied was how long did it take the results from randomized controlled trials published in the literature to actually impact patient care. So the two statistics in here, the 14% of research means 86% is ignored. And of the 14% that's paid attention to, it's taking 17 years to reach clinical practice. That's a really poor return on investment for funding agencies. And imagine, if you will, having a treatment for, a condition like cancer, and it's just not being used by clinicians. So this is a statistic that's widely cited today by implementation researchers and health services researchers to show that we have very poor research translation along this pipeline. And what we know is that a publication alone doesn't get a provider to adopt an evidence-based intervention, and guidelines alone do not get providers to adopt evidence-based interventions. And so this box over here on the right represents not necessarily a new branch of science, but a newly branded branch of science called implementation research, which is about promoting evidence-based care into real world settings. And what we know now, what is increasingly growing, is that there are partnerships that need to happen between scientists across these disciplines here on the left with this type of scientists that do implementation research to get knowledge into practice. Implementation research in and of itself is a unique body of science with unique interventions. They're not like the interventions that we're used to as clinical scientists. They have a different language. And I have to tell you that 13 years ago, I didn't understand most of what they were talking about when I met and got to meet many of the VA implementation scientists that worked at my hospital. But they are more and more about promoting evidence into practice. And until we as clinical researchers and health services researchers partner with them to get research into practice, we're going to continue to have this poor return on investment for the research that we're doing. So today I'm going to talk with you about my journey of getting sleep research promoted into practice. All right, so a lot of what I'm talking about will be data informed from severe TBI. And this is a slide that I've developed and used across a couple of different things because more and more, especially in the DoD and the VA healthcare system, people are focused on mild TBI because it's the more prevalent form of TBI in our healthcare system. But I had the opportunity to talk with a retired colonel and a DARPA scientific program manager many moons ago about this, the sort of the state of DoD and VA embracing severe TBI funded studies. Because I have to tell you, it's been hard to get severe TBI research funded when mild TBI has been the more prevalent problem. However, this particular DARPA project manager said to me that, Risa, your work in severe TBI is like studying extremophiles. And I'm like, extremophiles? And he said, yes. And he, extreme. So I had to go look up, what does he mean by this? So I put a definition for you on extremophiles. Extremophiles are living organisms that survive in the harshest physical and chemical environments. And scientists study them to understand what are sort of the basic ingredients needed to survive in those difficult environments. And what this retired colonel was trying to say to me is, if you can understand what it takes for a severe TBI patient to recover and have a good outcome, you might be able to inform the care of mild TBI. So I really like that analogy, and I use it often when giving my talks, because even though most of my talk is about severe TBI, I believe it will have implications for mild TBI. So, many of you already know this, that the IOM has concluded, IOM, now the National Academy of Medicine, has concluded that moderate to severe TBI is associated with many health comorbidities and disability that can require lifelong care. Similarly, this is my favorite systematic review in the literature by Matthias, showing that one of the prevalent comorbidities that we see after TBI is sleep disturbance and sleep disorders. However, from my perspective, one of the limitations of that meta-analysis is that the body of research done today really mixed injury severity levels. It looked at sleep disturbance at different time points, and it looked at sleep disturbance in different settings, and inferred that they were really talking about the same thing. And I'm going to present to you a different way of thinking about the study of sleep disturbance that these types of meta-analyses haven't addressed. But sleep problems are prevalent nonetheless after TBI and may be contributing to some of the long-term morbidity that we see after TBI. So let's move to mechanisms. And here's where I was inspired by my bench researchers, my colleagues doing bench research, and they can do things that we can't do in human studies. And so in nicely controlled conditions where animals are given an acquired brain injury, they studied what happened to the mice's recovery and to their brain when allowed to sleep or deprived of sleep after having an acquired brain injury. And what they were able to show is that in animals that are allowed to sleep after an acquired brain injury, there is a recovery to functional levels that approximate their pre-injury functioning, whereas animals that don't have the ability to sleep after brain injury, that they don't recover to the same functional level as they did prior to their brain injury. And when they went to sacrifice the animals and looked at what was happening in the brain, the animals allowed to sleep showed signs of endogenous brain repair mechanisms as highlighted here on this slide. I also like to point out that sleep is not a state of inactivity. One of my colleagues in sleep medicine and someone who's been a strong mentor to me, Dr. Daniel Schwartz, has always reinforced in his talks that our brain is busy during sleep and it is healing and replenishing from the busy daytime activity that has gone on. So sleep not only has a normal healing and restorative process that is needed for us every day, but sleep is critical, as we know from the animal literature, in recovery of function and promoting neuroplasticity. Now, around 2013, the animal work also highlighted some important things about aging with a brain injury, or we've inferred in aging with a brain injury in that they showed in animal models for the first time a new neuroanatomical structure, the glymphatic system, and demonstrated that the glymphatic system, which they liken to a waste clearing system, or if you will, a garbage truck, if you will, that comes in and allows for CSF to permeate the tissues in the brain and to clear neurotoxins that accumulate during the course of the day and drain them. And when in this shrinking of neurons and cells to allow the CSF to come in and clear the waste only happens during sleep. So again, another key consideration is that sleep is allowing for the normal cleaning that happens, if you will, that prevents accumulation of neurotoxins. These neurotoxins are those commonly present in neurodegenerative conditions. So at that point, people started to wonder if sleep was contributing to early aging, early cognitive decline, which the National Academy of Medicine has already shown is the case in moderate to severe TBI. So fast forward to 2013, when I was reading these articles, and it's really kind of sad for me because I have to limit the number of slides I can have, but there's a lot of work inspired by Don Stuss that got me to studying sleep from the acute confusion work that was inspired by his work, done there. But we published this article in 2013, which at the time was the largest study of sleep problems in acute inpatient rehabilitation in the literature. And so let me orient to what this slide is showing. So we had, from our acute confusion work that we had done over many years, ratings of cognition, motor recovery, and of sleep when people were recovering from TBI during inpatient rehabilitation. So the sleep item was an individual item from the delirium rating scale that rated people as having no sleep disturbance, mild sleep disturbance, moderate sleep disturbance, or severe sleep disturbance. And I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like in a minute. But what I want you to appreciate in these next columns is that we evaluated people serially throughout their hospitalization. The sequence 1 was their initial evaluation at the time of inpatient rehabilitation admission. It was a median of 24 days since injury. This is time since injury. Their second evaluation was a median of 29 days, and their third evaluation was a median of 33 days. And for the most part, from time 1 to sequence 3, it's just about a 2-week length of stay, which is in our healthcare system pretty typical on inpatient rehabilitation in the civilian healthcare system. That is not the case in the federal system for veterans and service members, but this was a study done in the civilian healthcare system. So down to the bottom, among this sample of approximately 250 consecutive TBI admissions to our facility, 85% came in with a mild, moderate, or severe sleep disturbance. 64% had a moderate or severe sleep disturbance. And as we are sending people out the door at the time of discharge, we still have 63% with a sleep problem, 33% with a moderate to severe sleep disturbance. So some of the matriculation of this work, when I decided, okay, I'm going to try to understand what's happening with this sleep problem, is that when I came to work at the Tampa VA, we were able to implement actigraphy monitoring with patients. So this is actually the first person that I ever put an actigraph watch on. And for those who are not familiar with that, it's a wrist-worn device that measures movement. So what you see here are 3 24-hour periods of movement. The black is the movement, the yellow is the white line. And in this particular setting, I'm letting the algorithm that accompanies the software estimate where the major rest intervals are. So this was on a Friday at 4 o'clock. And what the data is saying is that this individual did not sleep this first night, because the blue interval is there where it's estimating a sleep interval occurred. The next night we had a long interval, and I've since have come to call this a catch-up night, because you can only be sleep deprived for so long before your body needs that sleep with the adenosine accumulation. And so this is a catch-up night, but you can see the pattern begins again, day 3, with no major sleep interval identified. So at a time of critical neuro repair for this active duty service member with a severe brain injury, we have 1 period of sleep across 3 days. And that wasn't all that uncommon. So here are 2 more cases that I've been able to observe. The same thing here. In this case, we had a catch-up night on day 2, but then we begin this irregular pattern. And this is what I am talking about when I'm referring to moderate to severe sleep disturbance. We have a sleep disturbance that really is not well understood, but based on what we're learning from the animal literature, potentially disrupting neurologic recovery. Now, was that severe sleep disturbance a function of the TBI? So one of the things that I did in that cohort in that first paper was we divided people into 4 groups based on quartiles of how long it took for them to get to inpatient rehabilitation. So what you see here in group 1 are people who got to rehabilitation less than 16 days post-injury, and in group 4 were people who got to rehabilitation more than 34 days post-injury. And so across, as you would expect, the people who got to rehabilitation just past 2 weeks, they had less severe TBI than the people who took more than a month to get to rehabilitation. So we have the less severely injured here and the more severely injured in group 4. But what I want you to take away is that across these 4 groups, that a majority of the sample have a moderate to severe sleep disturbance, just like those pictures I showed you from the actograms. And over time, they are improving, but they are still leaving rehabilitation with anywhere from a quarter to a third unresolved. So here we have, in that same paper, I tried to look at the association with outcomes. So after controlling for things that I know typically predict the outcomes that were modeled, and in this paper, we modeled length of stay because I wanted to get a cost or a proxy for cost outcome, and I modeled the duration of post-traumatic amnesia. And I know that people will say, well, post-traumatic amnesia is typically a marker of injury severity. But I'll put back to you that if you think about how we measure post-traumatic amnesia, so post-traumatic amnesia, particularly in the TBI model system longitudinal study, is measured by assessing orientation and fluctuating neurologic presentation over time. So, cognition, fluctuation can all be impacted by sleep disturbance. So I modeled it as an outcome in this paper. So what we found is that after controlling for the things that we know predict those things, the presence of the severity of the sleep disturbance at 1 month post brain injury was still significantly predictive of these outcomes and contributing unique variants. So from this first paper that was really just exclusively focusing on the sleep problem that I observed in the study of acute confusion after brain injury, we learned that it's a pretty big problem. 85% come in with some degree of it. It gets better, but people are being discharged with it unresolved, and it's associated with poor outcomes. And so in that paper, we posed for the first time, is sleep a treatment target during inpatient rehabilitation? And we've since gone on to show that that sleep disturbance is associated with many other outcomes. We've shown that association with the ability to participate in rehab therapies, the course of acute cognitive recovery, their discharge status, and even 1-year productivity. And so more and more just solidifying that there is a strong signal between outcome and sleep disturbance. And others are finding the same thing. And so many of you are familiar with the other authors here, Michael Makeley, and the authors led by Catherine Duclos and others, highlighting that similar relationship between sleep and TBI outcome. So I don't know the background of everyone on the call, so I'm going to just give some contextual information along the way about sleep. Again, recognizing my colleagues in sleep medicine who help not only mentor me in sleep, but also in providing some of these slides. So here you have a hypnogram. This is a slide depicting the movement between the different stages of sleep throughout the night. Some important things to take away in this pattern is that we start out with smaller amounts of REM, but it lengthens as we sleep at night. And stage 3 sleep, which formerly known as stage 3 and 4, when I was back in school, it's now stage 3 sleep or N3 sleep, is more prolonged at the beginning of the night and abbreviated as we go through the night. And one of the things that's important to know about this pattern is that if you disrupt this pattern, that you actually may not pick up where you left off when you try to return to sleep. And so that has a lot of implications for, all the disruptions that happen in a hospital setting, because many of the things that we're doing to provide care during inpatient rehabilitation may actually be influencing these stages. And we need time in each of these stages because that stage is generated by a part of the brain, but it's also serving a restorative function. So our brains, for brain health, need time in each of these stages of sleep. Now, I often get asked by people when I've done these talks to various groups, like, well, how much sleep should we get? So I decided to add this slide to it, and I have incorporated this target in my actigraphy reports when I provide that clinical service on our rehab unit. And that the American Academy of Sleep Medicine put out a position statement a few years ago now with specific duration targets for adults and for children. And so if you go to their website, they have made them publicly available at aasm.org. But for adults ages 18 to 60, our target should be 7 or more hours of sleep. And the systematic review accompanying this position statement highlights that insufficient sleep or short sleep duration, there are many poor health outcomes, including obesity, hypertension, heart disease, impaired immune function, and suboptimal performance in general. And so it's an important target for our patients who sleep to get that amount of sleep on a regular basis, both early and later. And why is that? Well, this slide is really just, again, reinforcing that sleep facilitates brain health by restoring the cellular substrate, improving synaptic integrity and responsiveness. And each stage of sleep is associated with specific functions, including the promotion of long-term memory, particularly with stage 3 sleep, and what I tend to call areas of executive functioning with REM sleep. So again, important for us to spend time in each of those stages of sleep. And in order to do that, we need to go through that sequence uninterrupted for most of us adults, 7 to 9 hours at night. So transitioning to a management approach, I want to acknowledge Dr. William McDowell Anderson, who at the time was the training director when I approached sleep medicine about helping me do more to understand the sleep problem after TBI. And he handed me this article from the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine called The 5-Finger Approach to Sleep Management. And he said, we teach every sleep medicine fellow to think about these 5 domains when examining, when someone walks in the door and says they have a sleep disturbance. And for, really to comprehensively and appropriately address, we need to be evaluating what's contributing to them. So people can have medical problems that interfere with their sleep. And I just given you some examples here. Myself, I struggle with GERD, and it certainly wakes me up at night when I don't have it well controlled. People can have behavioral health problems that can disrupt their sleep, and that might be an appropriate source of intervention to promote better sleep. Medication side effects go often unrecognized, particularly in rehabilitation settings where we use a lot of medications to promote alertness and enhanced cognition during the day. I've certainly seen it be inadvertently prescribed in the middle of the night because they forgot to give it during the day, and so the person's now having sleep problems. There can be environmental contributors to sleep disturbance as well. Inpatient units are known for noise and a lot of bells and sounds, but other circadian drivers like just having intact vision is important. And I've certainly now, with eye injuries being very common during the war, seen sleep disruption due to blindness. And then obviously there are the primary sleep disorders that can influence someone's report of having a sleep problem. So one of the things to help me kind of reconcile some of the data that I was seeing coming out from others and trying to understand how to think about the 5-finger approach in my conceptualization of sleep problem. This is a framework that I have developed. And for those of you who get the big Brain Injury Medicine Bible by Ross Savant, Nathan Zasler, and Doug Katz, you'll actually see this in the next edition as the framework for thinking about sleep from a clinical management problem and from a research standpoint. For the most part, I find that people talk about post-traumatic sleep disturbance as a single thing, that it's this one problem and it permeates after brain injury, no matter when you're looking at a person. So I haven't found that to be the case when I'm studying people longitudinally. And certainly when I read the work of others, the sleep problem that you're seeing in the acute care setting after a moderate severe TBI seems very different than the problem that we see in rehabilitation. It seems to be not a severe presentation of that problem. And then the problem evolves when people leave the hospital and go into community care. Now, why is that? In this model, I'm highlighting that if TBI is contributing to the sleep problem, well, TBI changes. So it theoretically, it improves most of the time, hopefully, but for some, it's not the case. So if the TBI is changing, then the sleep problem should be changing. But the 5-finger approach, that framework says there are some other things that are likely contributing to the sleep problem in these different settings. So for example, when you think about the environment, an environment in the ICU is very different than these other settings where people are having neuro checks every 15 minutes or having vitals collected throughout the night. So you have that Zeitgeber disrupting your circadian pattern. And theoretically, that will lessen as a person is transitioning settings over time. Similarly, in the rehabilitation setting, our patients being up and in therapy during the day is a Zeitgeber as well. It's going to drive circadian rhythm because now you have people active and doing things during the day, hopefully promoting them sleeping at night. So that stimulation is important. And then obviously that evolves as people transition to an outpatient setting. The medical comorbidities may evolve as people transition over time from their TBI. Their medications obviously change, and their psychological health is very different. In these early stages, we see people in delirium or post-traumatic confusional state. As they evolve from their brain injury, they have more awareness of their deficits and can develop more, be more at risk for depression or anxiety. We don't know what the evolution of formal sleep disorders are over time, but it may or may not evolve. I don't know the answer to that. But this is a way for me to think about how a person's sleep is evolving after a brain injury. And when I look at studies, I'm sort of putting them into buckets and thinking about this. Now, I find it very overwhelming to think about how to write a grant and study sleep when you have all these potential contributors to the phenomena of post-traumatic sleep disturbance. But I tried to make it easy for myself. And that is, I started with formal sleep disorders. And I started with formal sleep disorders because there are evidence-based treatments available for them that could be adopted in TBI care. Very rarely is that the case, but I thought that was good low-hanging fruit to start to make a dent in what was going on with post-traumatic sleep disturbance. And so here you see on the AASM website many of the guidelines available for care. So why did I've decided sleep apnea, and I decided formal sleep disorders, and why did I pick sleep apnea? Well, because the clinicians that are dealing with TBI have an interesting dilemma. One, they need to have better information about how to best assess for these specific sleep disorders in order to know what is the evidence-based care that they need to implement. Again, thinking about implementation. So right now, a person's having a sleep problem. It's very poorly characterized in our clinical settings and often leads to the delivery of the wrong treatments, such as a medication. So, trazodone or Remeron are not evidence-based treatments for sleep apnea. So really the approach of needing to identify or improve characterization of the specific sleep problems is needed to deliver the right care to them. Right now, the guidelines that are available do not really tell you how to identify these problems in cognitively impaired patients or those in the acute rehabilitation setting. So this is a dilemma that our clinicians are facing. They don't know how to best identify these sleep problems so they can deliver the right care. So some other ways that help me pick OSA is Dr. Molayeva highlighted at the very beginning in her kind introduction. She and I were invited to be a part of a think tank meeting at the Galveston Brain Injury Conference to to help develop priorities for managing many of the TBI problems that patients experience in primary care. Now, a primary care physician has 15 minutes to do a bunch of things. And so we realized very quickly at that think tank meeting that they aren't going to be able to figure out how to identify all of the sleep problems that people have and point them in the right direction. So the approach that we took was, what's the one problem we need to have diagnosed first and get it treated and out of the way? And in that think tank meeting, that group prioritized identifying obstructive sleep apnea. Other forms of stakeholder input in this line of research came from patients and families, saying that of all the problems that people have after TBI, getting someone to regulate and have normal sleep patterns again was really important. And this was these kind of comments, this theme came up in patient and family focus groups as we were developing other grants about the timing and modality of delivering rehab therapies. They were telling us that really isn't the important thing to focus on here. We can't get people to stay awake to even participate in therapy. And then lastly, in a way to facilitate research translation, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality has put out the Future Research Needs Initiative. And if folks haven't seen it, it's really a cool initiative. And what they did is they got stakeholder input from all different types of stakeholders to identify priority problems in healthcare today. And to facilitate research in that area, they engaged stakeholders, did systematic reviews, and developed methodology for addressing these high priority medical problems in healthcare today. The last time I checked, the Future Research Needs Initiatives identified 44 problems. So there are 44 papers with elaborate methodology and recommendations for study. Of the 44 problems, 2 of them address sleep apnea. Future Research Needs paper 11 is on sleep apnea diagnosis, and paper 12 is on sleep apnea treatment. So across these different forms of stakeholders, OSA was prioritized as a big problem, and for good reason. So, key, again, thanks to my sleep medicine colleagues, they've highlighted that obstructive sleep apnea really is causing brain damage across 2 different mechanisms. And that always surprises people when I say that sleep problems can cause brain damage. I remember being asked that by a neurologist in a meeting, thinking he thought I was being controversial. But there's 2 things happening. One, when you have obstructive sleep apnea, you are constantly being awakened through the night because your oxygen levels are dropping and your brain doesn't ever want to be without oxygen or glucose. So a natural protective effect is to wake you up so that you breathe. And as a result, you're interfering with that pattern of sleep that I talked about earlier. So you're hindering your ability to spend time in those different stages of sleep. Secondarily, you're also depriving your brain of oxygen with recurring bouts of hypoxemia. And as a result, a reaction to those mechanisms of damage, there are many consequences. So hypertension is often a consequence of untreated sleep apnea, along with difficulty with managing blood sugars, cardiovascular problems, early morning headaches, and many other problems listed here today, including impaired cognition. So here is a spectral analysis done by one of our colleagues here, a signal processing engineer. Across the top, what you see is a person without obstructive sleep apnea going through the night. And what he's done is he superimposed the hypnogram to show you that the person is spending time in stage 3 sleep, primarily the beginning of the night, with it lessening throughout the night, and then small periods of REM that increase through the evening. So that's very similar to what I showed you before. And then what you see at the bottom is a person with really bad sleep apnea. And what I want you to notice is, because of the constant disruption to sleep, this individual is never getting past stage 2 sleep. they experience no REM, they experience no stage 3 sleep because of the constant interruption of OSA. So some other important things to highlight about OSA, and that is the economic impact. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society commissioned hypothetical modeling to show that this is the cost of diagnosing and treating OSA today in 2015, the cost of undiagnosed OSA, the cost of the accidents, the healthcare problems that people experience as a result of OSA cost the U.S. almost $150 billion. If we identified and treated everyone who had OSA, it would cost about $50 billion, but nonetheless, we would save $100 billion in a single year, highlighting that even though it costs more to diagnose and treat sleep apnea, in the long run, there's a healthcare savings. So I'm trying to be mindful of the time. I just want to highlight here, this was one of the first papers that we did in our group to show that sleep apnea was a problem on the rehabilitation unit in a consecutive series of 86 individuals undergoing level 2 polysomnography. 1 and 2 of our admissions were diagnosed with OSA. It was primarily mild OSA in our TBI sample, more severe in our stroke sample. And the things that predicted who was going to have sleep apnea weren't the traditional predictors that we see informed by the general population. Our sample was young, a median age of 37, and the only real predictor of OSA was their hypertensive status. What I'm going to do here is just really quickly highlight we are participating in a longitudinal study of mild TBI. This is a paper by one of my former postdocs, Amanda Garcia. This is out now in Journal of Neurotrauma. And what you see here are a bunch of cognitive tests across these domains in this mild TBI cohort of 375 individuals. And what we did is we tried to predict cognitive performance using all the things that typically predict cognitive performance in this cohort. And we picked and contributed their TBI status. And then we added to the model sleep apnea risk. We didn't have sleep apnea diagnostic data in this study, but we had their risk score using the stop bang. And what we found is that even after controlling for TBI and these other factors, sleep apnea risk was significantly associated with the trail making test, the coding test, and self-reported cognition. So highlighting that this work in moderate to severe TBI is bearing out in the mild TBI cohort as well. So here is a study that we just completed in the TBI model systems, looking at trying to help clinicians identify the right screening and diagnostic tools to identify sleep apnea earlier and get people to evidence-based treatment. This was a comparative effectiveness study of screening tools that were evidence-based from the literature and different kinds of diagnostic tests. The level 3 is a portable test. I think that's widely used today. And level 1 is the standard of being in a sleep lab. And so what I've done so far in the talk is really highlighted the bench research and the clinical research, and now I'm talking about the comparative effectiveness research to move this problem into practice. So this is a graphic just showing the 6 hospitals around the country. All of them are TBI model systems that collected data as part of this clinical trial. All the data came here to a centralized scoring center at the Tampa VA for analysis. And without much ado, just to let you know that the results are now out in the literature. What we found is that during inpatient rehabilitation, the stop bang and the multi-apnea prediction index are comparable in screening for sleep apnea. The Berlin questionnaire was not, it was less predictive of OSA. And from an identification of OSA definitively, we found that the portable tests were not as sensitive to OSA, thus they were not non-inferior. This was a non-inferiority aim. Basically what we found is that if the test was negative or mild, a person may still have significant OSA disease. So the good news, though, is that if the test did indicate you had OSA, you had it, but it may be more severe. So the test tended to underestimate the severity of OSA, which is important for driving people to treatment. This is another article that was inspired by Dan Schwartz, but what I just want to highlight from this slide for you is that when we use the American Academy of Sleep Medicine criteria, 66% of the sample from these 6 centers had OSA, which was really shocking. So hopefully that high quality data and rigorous methodology will inform future knowledge translation products, but we took the opportunity to try to understand some barriers to implementation. So we engaged stakeholders, and here's a picture of our stakeholder meeting that included physiatrists, sleep medicine physicians, all of these different individuals on this slide to talk about what would be barriers to using the findings from our trial. And we had a qualitative team who took us through analyzing responses collected via a graffiti wall, which is where we had questions posted around the room. And all of these stakeholders responded to the questions during the course of the 2-day meeting. And then this team analyzed them and we discussed them for action. We used this model of healthcare access. And I'm actually running out of time, so I don't want to spend really any time, but basically we identified barriers to adopting our recommendations from the patient's perspective and from the healthcare system's perspective. And this is a very detailed depiction of what the specific barriers might be. Here's what we learned from our stakeholders. We learned that from the consumer's perspective, patients and families, their belief about OSA is not good. They really needed health literacy interventions. And here's a quote from a caregiver who was at the meeting. She said, "Of the 12 appointments that I had after discharge, someone needed to tell me that it was important to follow up with sleep apnea for the test." Her loved one eventually got a diagnosis of OSA, but did so 3 years after his injury. And then from an infrastructure or healthcare provision standpoint, we learned that OSA, provider beliefs about OSA is a barrier to implementing screening and diagnosis and to promoting compliance with interventions. Funding for reimbursement and capitated payment systems was also a barrier, as well as the availability of the technology and trained staff on rehabilitation units. So we took that feedback from our stakeholders, and here are some of the action items that we did as a result of that feedback. We now have one paper published and another showing that it is more cost effective and cost beneficial to diagnose and treat sleep apnea than any of the other alternatives. We also created a fact sheet to help improve health literacy interventions. And we are now beginning a series of outcome papers that are targeting looking at the association of OSA and poor outcome leveraging the TBI model system data set. So this is just a slide showing that we now are linking in other studies OSA with many other outcomes that are commonly assessed after TBI rehabilitation, and that we now have a trial under review looking at if we provide early treatment for sleep apnea while people are still hospitalized, would that make a difference in neurologic outcome compared to people in a usual care arm where they're getting diagnosed and treated for sleep apnea in the outpatient setting. So this trial, it's a 4-center RCT, is now under review based on that stakeholder feedback. So this is the need highlighted by the Sleep Research Society and NIH in a really nice white paper. They talk about the fact that there's a lot of evidence for treating sleep disorders, but people are not using the evidence in daily practice. So they have in this white paper several recommended areas for future implementation research. And I don't want to spend any more time talking about it. I'll let you read it at your request. And I want to thank all of the Sleepy staff who helped us get this work done. Thank you to my collaborators, and I'm going to actually stop there and see if there are any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. Quite enjoyed. To the audience, we we're almost out of time, but I think we can allow one or two questions if there are any questions. I think there's one question so far typed that saying thank you for the great presentation, Dr. Nakase Richardson. When is best to assess sleep function in patients with TBI? What specialty is in best position to perform the assessments?
So it's a great question. The answer depends on what you're assessing and in what setting. I think is sort of my question, because certainly many providers have in their scope of practice the ability to give paper and pencil tests, to utilize actigraphy, but I've always found it really helpful to have sleep medicine involved, because they're going to be the bearers to bring, what are the evidence-based treatments that align with it. I didn't have time in today's 1-hour talk to really discuss any of the circadian work that we've done. I just tried to focus in on OSA, but that's another great example of an area where we really have not explored, earlier in recovery, the benefit of the frontline interventions for circadian rhythm disorders after TBI.
Great, thank you. So that previous question was from Dr. Molayeva. Now the next question is from Dr. Yadullahi. She's saying, thanks for the great talk. My question is, what are the barriers for sleep apnea diagnosis, and whether there's evidence that sleep apnea treatment improves outcome?
So that is the exact focus of our randomized control trial that's under review. Our stakeholders, our provider stakeholders have that question too. They said, will it make a difference if we treat OSA while people are still hospitalized, or is the outcome going to be the same if we do it on an outpatient basis? And obviously there are a lot of cost barriers to doing it on the inpatient basis side, as well as infrastructure barriers. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I hope to have the answer to that question at the end of our study if funded.
Great, thank you. It's 1 p.m., so I realize some people might have meetings. So if you have meetings, please feel free to leave. But I'm going to ask one more question. And if you have time, stick around for this question as well.
Yes. Okay.
This question is from Dr. Julia Ferlin. He's saying, excellent work in presentation. Thank you. What portable device do you use for home-based sleep studies?
So I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm going to say that. I have used in my research a couple of different devices. As a part of the trial we just finished, the device we used was the Nox T3, and we actually picked that device based on stakeholder input. Our sleep medicine clinicians really did recommend that. They felt it would be the easiest to use, and Nox T3 actually came to the table and became a stakeholder in our trial. I think they're doing some really innovative things to also look at phenotypes of obstructive sleep apnea that might be available in future software updates. And with almost no time to go into that, just to say that not all OSA is the same, and that these phenotypes of sleep apnea that infer different mechanisms may need different types of treatment rather than the standard frontline intervention of PAP therapy. So I think devices that offer some edge in that regard are interesting.
Thank you. Can I add a follow-up question to that?
Yes.
Do you have metrics on performance of this home-based monitoring devices, and also specifically broken down to different conditions? So different, is there performance equal for CSA and OSA, for example?
Yeah, so there are guidelines available on the AASM website about the use of portable devices like the level 3s, and there's some wonderful systematic reviews out there to help guide you. We are able to see both CSA and OSA in the devices. In our so I don't have the metrics available for the general population in my mind, but I could tell you that central sleep apnea in our 6-center study was rare. of the 247 cases that made it into our first paper that got level 1 polysomnography, only 3 had central sleep apnea. We're seeing primarily obstructive sleep apnea in this cohort. And it may be because of the bias in the sample we're getting, but also, you know, my colleagues in sleep medicine have said is that one of the major contributors to central sleep apnea is polypharmacy. And so if you think about that framework I highlighted, polypharmacy is dynamic when people are recovering from TBI. And so medications that are high risk, like opioids or anything with a respiratory depressant, may be contributing to the respiration suppression, which is what central sleep apnea is. And sorry, my puppy is barking in the background. What we see in the rehabilitation setting is that a lot of polypharmacy is being, minimized, and people are being pulled off of medications. And so, that's one of the reasons why I think I didn't see a lot of central sleep apnea across the independent study we did before that and our 6-center trial. Very little central sleep apnea.
Excellent. Thank you again for a wonderful talk. It's 5 past, so I think we're gonna wrap up and allow. Oh, actually, there's maybe one more question. If you are you available? Are you okay to stay?
I can talk.
Okay. And again, to the rest of the audience, if I realize it's past the time, so if you can, where's Angela? Oh, I think our the person who wanted to ask a question left, so maybe she had another meeting as well. So okay, so I think we can wrap up, and let's thank our speaker again. I still haven't figured out how to do this online, but I'm gonna clap here, and I'm inviting all the rest to do the same. And thank you for a wonderful talk.